Gold, the metal that refused to die. Somewhere right now, in a vault beneath a central bank, in a wedding ring on someone's finger, in a phone in your pocket, and in a bar stacked in a bunker built to survive a nuclear war, there's a piece of the same element. Gold. And of everything humans have ever decided to value, gold is the one substance that has never really gone out of style, not once, in over 5,000 years of recorded history. Empires have risen and collapsed. Currencies have been born and have died. Entire economic systems have been invented and abandoned. And through all of it, gold just kept sitting there, quietly being wanted. So the question worth asking isn't just, why is gold valuable? It's something a little deeper. Why is gold, out of every material available to human beings, managed to hold on to that value for this long, across every culture, every era, every economic system we've ever tried? To answer that, we have to start with chemistry, because gold's entire story actually begins with a set of physical properties that happen to be almost perfectly suited for becoming money, long before anyone ever used the word money at all. Gold doesn't rust. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't corrode in air or water the way iron or copper does. Archaeologists have pulled gold objects out of tombs that are thousands of years old, and they still gleam almost exactly as they did the day they were buried. That single property, resistance to decay, matters enormously if you're trying to store value over long periods of time. Nobody wants a currency that quietly rusts away in a drawer. It's also remarkably easy to work with. Gold is soft enough to be hammered into incredibly thin sheets or drawn into fine wire, using nothing more than basic tools. A skilled goldsmith with equipment that would look primitive to us today could still shape it into jewelry, coins, or decorative objects with real precision. And it's rare enough that you can't just stumble across it everywhere, but not so rare that ancient civilizations never found any at all. That balance, uncommon but not impossible to find, turns out to be exactly the sweet spot needed for something to function as a reliable store of value. So where did humans actually find their first gold? The earliest evidence of gold being used by human societies goes back roughly 6,000 years, in a region that today spans parts of Bulgaria, where archaeologists uncovered an ancient burial site containing thousands of gold objects, some of the oldest known worked gold in the world. But the civilization that really turned gold into something close to a national identity was ancient Egypt. Egypt sat right next to the Nubian gold fields, along the Nile in what's now Sudan, and the Egyptians mined this gold extensively for thousands of years. In fact, the very name Nubia is believed by many historians to derive from the ancient Egyptian word for gold. The pharaohs didn't just use gold for jewelry. They believed gold was literally the flesh of the gods, an eternal, unchanging substance fit only for the divine and the ruling class that claimed to represent them on earth. This is why you find death masks, sarcophagi, and burial chambers absolutely layered in gold. It wasn't decoration in the way we might think of decoration today. It was believed to be a genuinely sacred material, tying the pharaoh's body to eternity itself. Egyptian mining operations were surprisingly sophisticated for their era. Workers dug shafts deep into desert hillsides, crushed the gold-bearing quartz rock by hand, and then washed the crushed material to separate out the heavier gold particles, a process not fundamentally different in principle from techniques still used in small-scale mining today. Ancient Egyptian records, including maps drawn on papyrus that still survive, show mining routes leading out into the eastern desert, making them some of the oldest geological maps in human history. Now, while Egypt was extracting gold from the earth, on the other side of the Mediterranean, another civilization was doing something arguably even more important, figuring out how to turn raw gold into standardized money. This brings us to the Kingdom of Lydia, in what's now Western Turkey, sometime around the 7th century BCE. The Lydians had access to a river called the Pactolus, which carried natural deposits of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold, and silver washed down from nearby mountains. At first, Lydian traders used raw chunks of this electrum for transactions. But there was an obvious problem. No two pieces contained exactly the same ratio of gold to silver, which meant nobody could be entirely sure what any given piece was actually worth. The solution the Lydians eventually landed on changed the course of economic history. Rather than trading unpredictable natural alloy, Lydian rulers began separating gold and silver into pure, standardized units, stamped with an official royal seal guaranteeing their weight and purity. This is widely credited as the birth of true coinage, the moment when a government first backed a piece of metal with its own authority, transforming gold from a raw material into something closer to what we would recognize as currency. Once this idea existed, it spread with remarkable speed. Greek city-states adopted their own gold and silver coinage. The Persian Empire developed a gold coin called the daric, used to pay soldiers and fund an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. And by the time Alexander the Great was building his own empire a few centuries later, gold coinage had become the standard tool for financing armies, paying officials, and conducting trade across enormous distances, tying together economies that had never had a shared medium of exchange before. Rome took this even further, developing one of the most sophisticated monetary systems the ancient world had ever seen, built around gold and silver coinage minted to strict, government-controlled standards. The Roman aureus, their primary gold coin, was trusted enough to circulate not just within the empire, but well beyond its borders, into regions Rome never even directly controlled. This is actually one of the earliest examples of a currency functioning almost like a global reserve currency, trusted simply because the issuing authority behind it was powerful and stable. But Rome's own history also teaches us something crucial about gold and trust, something that echoes all the way into modern economics. As Rome's military expenses spiraled upward over the centuries, and the empire faced mounting financial pressure, emperors began quietly reducing the amount of actual gold and silver contained in their coins, replacing it with cheaper base metals while keeping the coins looking roughly the same on the surface. This practice, known as debasement, initially allowed the government to stretch its finances further. But people weren't fooled forever. As it became clear that coins contained less real precious metal than before, trust in Roman currency steadily eroded, prices rose, and this monetary instability became one of several contributing factors in Rome's long economic decline. It's an early, striking lesson in a pattern that would repeat itself again and again throughout history. A currency is really only as trustworthy as the promise standing behind it, and gold coinage worked precisely because debasing it was something people could eventually detect and punish with their own declining trust. Now let's shift continents for a moment, because gold's story isn't just a European or Middle Eastern one. Some of history's most staggering gold wealth developed entirely independently, half a world away. In West Africa, between roughly the 11th and 16th centuries, the Mali Empire controlled access to some of the richest gold deposits then known anywhere on Earth. Gold from Mali's territory is believed to have supplied a substantial share of the gold circulating throughout Europe and the Islamic world during this era, flowing north across trans-Saharan trade routes on camel caravans, exchanged for salt, another substance so valuable at the time that it was sometimes literally traded ounce for ounce against gold. Mali's wealth became almost legendary because of one particular ruler, Mansa Musa, who reigned in the early 14th century and is still regarded by many economic historians as possibly the wealthiest individual in recorded human history, though putting an exact modern dollar figure on his fortune is genuinely difficult given how different his economy was from ours. What we do know for certain comes from something very concrete. In 1324, Mansa Musa undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca, traveling with an enormous retinue and reportedly distributing so much gold along the way. particularly while passing through Cairo, that he is said to have caused a significant, lasting drop in the local value of gold in Egypt, an effect that some accounts suggest lingered in regional markets for years afterward. It's a remarkable, well-documented example of a single individual's spending genuinely reshaping a regional economy, purely through the sheer volume of gold he brought with him. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, entirely separate civilizations were developing their own profound relationship with gold, completely disconnected from anything happening in Europe, Africa, or Asia. The Inca Empire, along with earlier cultures in the Andes, mined and worked gold extensively, but with a strikingly different worldview attached to it. For many Indian cultures, gold was closely associated with the sun, often described in accounts as the sweat of the sun, while silver was linked to the moon. Crucially, gold in Inca society generally wasn't used as currency in the way it was in Europe or Asia. It held ceremonial, religious, and decorative significance instead, appearing in temples, on ceremonial objects, and in offerings to their gods. This difference turned out to have enormous, tragic historical consequences. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 16th century, they encountered societies with real gold wealth, but with a fundamentally different relationship to that wealth than European monetary culture had. The Spanish, driven by their own culture's deep association between gold and monetary power, proceeded to extract staggering quantities of gold and silver from the Americas over the following centuries, fundamentally reshaping the entire global economy in the process. So much precious metal flowed into Spain, and from Spain into the wider European economy, that it triggered a sustained, long-term rise in prices across much of Europe, an economic phenomenon historians now generally call the price revolution, one of the earliest large-scale examples in recorded history of a simple truth. Pour a huge amount of new money into an economy, and you shouldn't be surprised when prices start climbing. By the 19th century, many of the world's major economies began formally tying the value of their national currencies directly to a fixed, specific quantity of gold. Britain adopted this system fairly early, and as the British Empire expanded its economic reach across the globe throughout the century, other major economies gradually followed suit, aiming for a similar kind of monetary stability and international credibility. The core logic behind the gold standard was straightforward and, on paper, genuinely appealing. If your currency is directly redeemable for a fixed amount of gold, then in principle, a government can't simply print unlimited amounts of money without consequence, because doing so would eventually require it to hand over more gold than it actually possesses in reserve. This built-in discipline was seen as a powerful defense against the kind of runaway currency debasement that had plagued Rome, medieval kingdoms, and countless other governments throughout history. For several decades, this system genuinely helped support a remarkable era of relatively stable international trade and investment. Businesses and investors could exchange different national currencies with real confidence, because each one was tied to something tangible and universally recognized as valuable. But the gold standard also carried a serious structural weakness. It tightly limited how much a government could realistically respond to major economic shocks, since expanding the money supply during a genuine crisis was constrained by exactly how much physical gold that government happened to be sitting on at that particular moment. This weakness became brutally apparent during the 20th century's major crises. World War I forced most major economies to temporarily abandon strict gold convertibility just to fund the sheer scale of wartime spending. Then the Great Depression of the 1930s exposed the gold standard's limitations even further, as countries still clinging tightly to it found themselves with far less flexibility to respond to a collapsing economy than countries that had already cut those ties. After the devastation of the Second World War, world leaders gathered in the American town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944, to design an entirely new global monetary framework. Under this new system, the US dollar itself became directly convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, while other major currencies were pegged to the dollar rather than to gold directly. In effect, the dollar became the world's primary reserve currency, with gold serving as the ultimate anchor sitting quietly underneath the entire structure. This system held for roughly a quarter of a century, but by the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, the United States faced mounting economic pressures. Persistent trade deficits and the enormous costs of the Vietnam War meant that foreign governments were increasingly demanding to convert their growing stockpiles of dollars back into actual physical gold, which was steadily draining America's gold reserves at Fort Knox and elsewhere. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would fundamentally reshape the global economy for good. He formally suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, an event now commonly referred to as the Nixon shock. From that moment forward, the world's major currencies, the dollar very much included, became what economists call fiat currencies, meaning their value is no longer backed by any physical commodity at all. Instead, that value rests entirely on collective trust, government policy, and broader confidence in the overall stability of the issuing economy. This was, without exaggeration, one of the most significant turning points in the entire history of money, marking the first time in centuries that the world's dominant currencies were completely severed from any fixed connection to gold. So here's the genuinely fascinating part of this story. You might reasonably assume that once gold was no longer formally backing any major world currency, its economic importance would simply fade away into the background. But that's not remotely what happened. If anything, gold's role has continued to evolve and, in many respects, has actually grown even more significant in recent years. Today, central banks around the world still hold enormous reserves of physical gold, and in recent years, many of them have actually been buying substantially more of it. Countries like China have been steadily and consistently increasing their gold reserves for years, adding to their stockpiles nearly every single month. Other central banks across Asia and Eastern Europe have followed a broadly similar pattern. The underlying reasoning is fairly consistent across these institutions. Gold offers a genuine hedge against currency instability, against geopolitical risk, and importantly, against over-reliance on any single foreign currency, the US dollar very much included. This brings us to a genuinely important modern economic question. Why does gold still function this way, even in a world of purely digital, fiat-based money? Part of the answer circles right back to those same basic physical properties we started with at the very beginning. Gold doesn't decay. It can't simply be conjured into existence by any central bank printing more of it, unlike ordinary paper or digital currency. Its total global supply grows only slowly, constrained by the genuine physical difficulty and cost of mining new gold out of the ground. And crucially, it isn't any single country's specific liability. A dollar is fundamentally a claim on the American financial system. A euro is a claim on the Eurozone. But gold, sitting quietly in a vault, isn't a claim on anyone or anything at all. It just sits there, and that particular quality becomes especially appealing during periods when trust in any specific government or currency starts to genuinely wobble. Modern gold mining itself has become an extraordinarily sophisticated global industry. Where ancient Egyptian miners once crushed quartz by hand and washed it in the Nile, today's mining operations use massive earth-moving machinery, complex chemical extraction processes, and increasingly, satellite-based geological surveys to locate promising new deposits before a single shovel ever breaks ground. The largest gold-producing countries today include China, Russia, Australia, and Canada, among several others, and modern mines routinely extract or in which gold makes up only a few grams for every single ton of rock processed. An almost staggering illustration of just how much raw material has to be. And yet, despite this enormous, industrial-scale modern effort, all of the gold that has ever been mined throughout the entirety of human history would still fit into a surprisingly modest space, commonly estimated at somewhere in the range of a cube with sides of roughly 20 to 22 meters. Every wedding ring, every gold bar sitting in every central bank vault, every ancient Egyptian death mask, every Incan sun temple ornament, all of it combined would still fit into something not drastically larger than a modest office building. That relative scarcity, especially set against the sheer scale of the modern global economy, is a significant part of why gold has managed to retain real value for this long. So where does all of this leave us today? Gold no longer directly backs the world's major currencies, and it hasn't for over half a century now. But it clearly hasn't disappeared from the global economy either. It sits quietly in central bank vaults as a genuine strategic reserve asset. It gets actively traded on financial markets as a hedge against inflation and broader economic uncertainty. It continues to be worn, quite literally, as jewelry in nearly every culture on the planet, carrying real cultural and symbolic weight that has nothing to do with any modern balance sheet. And in moments of genuine economic anxiety, whether that's rising inflation, geopolitical conflict, or simple uncertainty about where the broader economy might be headed next, people and institutions alike still consistently turn back toward it. Maybe that's the real, enduring lesson buried underneath this entire 5,000-year story. Currencies get invented, reformed, and eventually abandoned. Entire economic systems rise, get restructured, and sometimes collapse completely. Empires that once controlled vast gold reserves have vanished from the map entirely. But gold itself has never actually needed any of those systems to remain valuable in the first place. It doesn't require a government's promise behind it, doesn't need a central bank's careful backing, doesn't depend on any particular political system surviving intact. It just sits there, dense, quietly gleaming, and stubbornly resistant to the passage of time, in exactly the same way it always has. And perhaps that's precisely why, after everything else humanity has built, tried, and eventually discarded across 5,000 years of economic history, we still, even now, keep coming back to the exact same metal.